Well, good evening, everybody. Time for us to get started. We need to wrap up Numbers chapter 18. So we got most of the way through the chapter and talking about these gifts that the Lord has given to Aaron. So this is all on the heels of Korah's rebellion. Korah and his cronies want the priesthood, and God has secured the priesthood for Aaron and for his sons. He has demonstrated through the budding of Aaron's staff that the house of Aaron is the appointed priest. And so it's natural at this point in the law that the Lord lays out the obligations and the terms of Aaron's priesthood. So in short, what is Aaron's job? What does he have to put into it? What's he there for?
He's the high priest.
Yeah, he is the high priest. And what's his job?
He has to go in once a year.
For atonement. Yeah, so it's not the offering of incense; it's the atonement offering. Now, the way that he offers atonement for the people, we could talk about the Day of Atonement, but here in Numbers 18, the specific thing that the Lord talks about with Aaron at the beginning of the chapter is he says, "You and your sons and your father's house with you shall bear iniquity connected with the sanctuary, and you and your sons with you shall bear iniquity connected with your priesthood." And that is, generally speaking, the job of the priesthood, is to bear iniquity. All right, so here it's focused on the sanctuary and the priesthood itself, but elsewhere in the law we've read that they bear iniquity for the whole congregation of Israel. That is their job, is to bear iniquity. And while we're talking about what you might consider to be a detriment of the priesthood, right? You wouldn't necessarily consider it a good thing. Like if you were a priest and God said, all right, I'm going to take the iniquity of the people and I'm going to put it on you. You're going to bear the iniquity. You'd consider that a burden, right? So let's talk about other burdens of the priesthood. What does everybody else in Israel get that the priesthood doesn't get? Yeah, the inheritance. They do not get an inheritance. And in fact, the sons of Joseph essentially get a double inheritance, right? Which is why we have the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. But we don't have any tribal allotment for Levi. Instead, what is Levi's? What's Levi's inheritance? What the congregation gives. Yeah, and the Lord puts it. He mentions something else. He says, let's see, we skip down to verse 20. The Lord said to Aaron, "You shall have no inheritance in their land, neither shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the people of Israel." Right, he's calling Levi and Israel more broadly to faith. Now, the gifts that they receive from the congregation of Israel fits into that, because this is all of the stuff that you would normally get by having your inheritance in Israel. Right? Your land is the way that you get your livestock, and you get your produce, and you get your money. Everything, all of your living comes from your inheritance. Your inheritance is your life, which is why all through the Hebrew Scriptures we see the inheritance equated with life. Levi does not have a physical inheritance, but they are given what we should consider a greater inheritance. Their inheritance, their portion, is the Lord Himself. All right, so again, that's where the law is pointing us forward to a greater spiritual truth that we don't see really fulfilled and consummated until Christ. But they are still given these provisions which they miss out on for not having a physical, an earthly inheritance. So we we reviewed the gifts that God has laid out to Aaron. So he's given him the priesthood. He's given him the whole tribe of Levi to watch over him and guard him in his priesthood. He's given him the food offerings. He has given him the firstborn of Israel, both of men and of beasts. So remember, the animals are sacrificed, at least the clean ones, and the sons of Aaron get a portion out of that. What happens to all of the unclean animals and to all of the firstborn sons of Israel? Sorry? They have to be redeemed. Yes, so 5 shekels of silver, and that all goes to the sons of Aaron. All right, so we're going to continue along this vein starting in verse 21, although the scope is going to broaden. So whereas up to this point, the Lord has been speaking to Aaron, and all of these promises and terms have been focused on Aaron. Now it's going to broaden out to the whole house of Levi. So that's where we'll go in just a second. Any questions or comments before we pray together? All right, then let's bow. Righteous Heavenly Father, thank you for the great gifts that you have given us tonight. Thank you for our time together to study from your word. Thank you, Father, for the great high priest that you have given us in your Son, Jesus. Father, as we read through the priesthood of Aaron and as we consider all of the things attached to that, help us, Father, to have more gratitude and a greater appreciation for the priesthood of Jesus of Nazareth. That he has offered himself as a sacrifice for us, that he intercedes for us and bears our iniquity, and that he offers us far greater sacrifices than the house of Aaron could offer to Israel, that he has offered himself once for all. Righteous Father, help us to take hope in his sacrifice and help us to pattern ourselves after the life of Jesus. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right, verse 21. To the Levites I have given every tithe in Israel for an inheritance, in return for the service that they do, their service in the tent of meeting, so that the people of Israel do not come near the tent of meeting, lest they bear sin and die. But the Levites shall do the service of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations, and among the people of Israel they shall have no inheritance. For the tithe of the people of Israel, which they present as a contribution to the Lord, I have given to the Levites for an inheritance. Therefore I have said of them that they shall have no inheritance among the people of Israel. All right, so whenever we talk about the tithe, that 10th part that Israel has to give, we normally think of it as a sacrifice to the Lord, right? A contribution to the Lord. That's not what the law lays out here, or what it does kind of, right? It says that it's presented as a contribution to the Lord, but then the Lord turns around and gives it to the tribe of Levi. Right, and that's a step that sometimes in our discussions about the tithe we miss, that like the whole tithe goes to the tribe of Levi, except for a part that we're going to read about in just a second. So this is the broader house of Levi's inheritance. They don't get land either. We'll read later on they're going to get some cities to live in. And they have places to stay basically all throughout Israel. But they're not landed like the other tribes are. Instead, for their living, they get this tithe. All right, now from that, and this is in exchange for their service, obviously. From that, we read in verse 25, And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Moreover, you shall speak and say to the Levites, When you take from the people of Israel the tithe that I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present a contribution from it to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe. And your contribution shall be counted to you as though it were the grain of the threshing floor, and as the fullness of the winepress. So you shall also present a contribution to the Lord from all your tithes, which you receive from the people of Israel. And from it you shall give the Lord's contribution to Aaron the priest. Out of all the gifts to you, you shall present every contribution due to the Lord. From each its best part is to be dedicated. Therefore you shall say to them, when you have offered from it the best of it, then the rest shall be counted to the Levites as produce of the threshing floor, and as produce of the winepress. And you may eat it in any place, you and your households, for it is your reward in return for your service in the tent of meeting. And you shall bear no sin by reason of it, when you have contributed the best of it. But you shall not profane the holy things of the people of Israel, lest you die. All right, so the Lord's portion of this is the tithe of the tithe. So 100th part of the original tithe, or not, 100th part of the produce of the congregation of Israel, right? They bring a tenth of that to Levi, and then Levi takes a tenth of that tenth to contribute, and that's going to go to Aaron and his house. But notice the way it's laid out. So whenever Israel gives their tithe in contribution to the Lord, so this tithe that's going to go to Levi, what part do they give? I mean, they just pick out, just any old bushel of grain or any old, ewe lamb from the flock. Yeah, they're supposed to give the best. And then out of that, Levi is supposed to turn around and give the best tenth out of that to the Lord. So notice how it's winnowed down in that way. So Levi is doing pretty well. They get the best part of what Israel produces. But the very best part, the top 1%, as it were, goes to the Lord. And this is the way that Levi has their living in the land. Now, I didn't have a whole lot to say about this, but we mainly just didn't have time to get to it on Sunday. Wayne?
You say the 10% goes to the Lord. How does it go to the Lord? You store it up someplace, or is it given to, I thought it was given to Aaron.
No, I said, yeah, it goes to Aaron.
Okay, it goes to Aaron.
That's what the text says anyway.
That's what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
It goes to Aaron, so it's for his use.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it's not just going into a storage bin someplace to be laying around.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, so to my understanding, at least the way the text reads, it says, from it you shall give the Lord's contribution to Aaron the priest.
Well, everything that they give, okay, whatever they raise.
So whatever Levi gives, so the tithe of the tithe. Yeah.
Whatever the congregation gives, whatever Levi, okay, it's all used up.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like put away in a bank someplace to keep storage.
So elsewhere in the law, we read that the tithe is to be laid up because it's not all going to be used at once, right? Because the tithe doesn't come in constantly, right? You think about in an agrarian society, when does your produce come in? How many harvest times do you have a year? Typically you have one, right? I mean, different crops you can have different harvest times.
But it's put away
For use. Yeah, for use.
It's not put away to be put in museums. Say, here's our tithe, everybody pass by.
It's not just stored.
Yeah. Right. So, and one of the things that we're going to read later in the law, we find this in Deuteronomy, is that the use of the tithe is expanded out to include not only Levi, but anybody else who doesn't have an inheritance in Israel, which includes the fatherless, the widow, the sojourner, the typical protected classes in the law. So people who cannot provide for themselves because they have, either they never had an inheritance like the sojourner, or they've lost their inheritance, before the year of Jubilee. So they're included in people who can take of the tithe. I would need to do I need to do some more digging into that to see if any part of it is sacrificed. I suspect that part of it is sacrificed and Aaron receives a memorial portion. That's what you normally see with sacrifice. But for this tithe that goes to Levi, that 90% that he gets to keep, none of it is sacrificed. It's all just stuff that he gets to eat. Right, yeah. Exactly, yeah. But the tithe of the tithe, our text tells us in verse 28, goes to Aaron the priest. And so the question is, does the whole thing count as part of Aaron's living, or does he have to sacrifice some of it and then just eat a memorial portion? I would need to look that up and figure out a good answer to that question. Because I could see it going either way. In the text, it doesn't specify. So, good question, though. Wayne?
This is going someplace.
Okay.
So all this is kind of, if you were to think of a certain way, it could be a foreshadowing.
I mean, that's the way that you see things treated in the book of Acts. If we're ultimately heading towards, like, if that's where you're wanting to go with it. The first offerings that were taken up in the early church in the book of Acts were specifically told they're for taking care of people's needs so that nobody has any lack.
They sit around the back and they store it up and draw it because it didn't get taken out in 15, 20 years.
Who knows how long it would have taken. Now, we do know that it is stored up, though. And the tithe itself is not brought in all that often. In fact, the storage requirement that we read about in Deuteronomy, I forget what chapter, if it's 15, might be 15, but one of the storage requirements only has them storing stuff up like every 3 years. So this is meant to last a while. So they are, I don't think the expectation is you empty it out all the time, right? The expectation is you bring in the tithe and you use out of it what you need.
I'm asking because
Yeah.
I go split.
Huh?
That's what this split is all about.
Oh yeah, I mean, who can even begin to count the number of splits over the treasury? Yeah. Yep.
I just one.
Yeah, I do think that the way that the early church treats their treasury in the book of Acts is heavily informed by this law and the other laws that we read about taking care of the protected classes in the law of Moses. Right, that they are fulfilling what Israel should have been doing under the law, but never did. And so it's this, but it's more than just this. It's also things like the year of release and the year of Jubilee, and the other protections that we read in the law for the fatherless widow and sojourner. And it's also, the other thing that we have to remember about it is that it is restricted to those in the brotherhood who have need. Yeah, and that it is typically restricted to those, Paul's definition of who is in need, like whenever you look at the case of widows, it's pretty restrictive, isn't it? So the kinds of arguments that we tend to have over the treasury, honestly, I can see why we have those arguments, because you can, if you cherry pick from one place, you can say, oh, we ought to be really liberal with our treasury. If you cherry pick from another place, you can say, no, we ought to have an iron fist around our treasury. And I think that's where some of the arguments come from.
Well, I think in fact in the New Testament we have to also know and realize they were moved by the Holy Spirit. They had the administration of the Holy Spirit. I mean, they'd seen the Christ, they had seen the miracles, they'd been there, they'd seen it, their feelings were, man, we really did something wrong, we got to get something right. And that kind of was the impetus towards their being so liberal and open-handed, because they knew this was required by their law. If you go back and read the law, that was required by the law.
Yeah, but I do, and I do think that what we see in the early church, like I said, is a fulfillment of this kind of stuff. That the early church was doing what Israel should have been doing. So any other questions or comments about the tithe or the tithe of the tithe? All right, so good questions. So let's get into Numbers chapter 19. All right, and this one, the first bit that we're going to read is, well, you'll see, it's an odd commandment, or it might strike us as odd. Not as odd, I think, as the sota ordeal. That one's just really weird, right? But this one, as we read through, you'll see it has some interesting distinctives to it. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, "This is the statute of the law that the Lord has commanded. Tell the people of Israel to bring you a red heifer without defect, in which there is no blemish, and on which a yoke has never come. And you shall give it to Eleazar the priest, and it shall be taken outside the camp and slaughtered before him. And Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger, and sprinkle some of its blood towards the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. And the heifer shall be burned in his sight. Its skin, its flesh, and its blood with its dung shall be burned. And the priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet yarn, and throw them into the fire, burning the heifer. Then the priest shall wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and afterward he may come into the camp. But the priest shall be unclean until evening. The one who burns the heifer shall wash his clothes in water and bathe his body in water, and shall be unclean until evening. And a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and deposit them outside the camp in a clean place. And they shall be kept for the water for impurity for the congregation of the people of Israel. It is a sin offering. And the one who gathers the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. And this shall be a perpetual statute for the people of Israel and for the stranger who sojourns among them." All right, so here we have a sacrifice that is being made. Let's start with the stuff that might strike us as normal. All right, let's start with the stuff that, as we've got experience with the law of Moses, we look at that and we say, yeah, that's typical law of Moses. So what things do we see in this sacrifice that are normal for the law of Moses? Like for the law's requirements for sacrifice? Yes, the animal has to be perfect, right? Without defect, in which there is no blemish. Okay, is there anything else that strikes us as normal about this sacrifice? The sprinkling of blood, very good. Sorry? Okay, now that's an interesting matter, because does a sacrifice normally make the priest unclean? Not that I'm aware of. Now, the sacrifice is ultimately for purification, right? So that's what these ashes are going to be used for, and that's ultimately what all sacrifices are for, is purification from sin. So in that sense, that's normal. And also, who offers the sacrifice in this case? Yeah, it's a priest, and that's completely normal. Yeah, it's not the high priest Aaron, but it's Eleazar, his son, who is also ordained a priest. That's normal. All right, now let's go ahead and get into the weird stuff. It's done outside the camp. What else is weird about this sacrifice? Okay, yeah, yes, it is a whole sacrifice where you normally read about the skin being taken off and certain other parts of the animal being taken out, along with the dung, the bowels of the animal. Those are taken outside of the camp and burnt, but the animal itself usually stays there in the courtyard and is burnt, is offered on the altar of burnt offering. But the whole thing, is offered in one fire outside of the camp. That's unusual. All right, any other unusual things about this sacrifice? It made the priest unclean. That is unusual. And then the red heifer itself. Now, what's unusual about a red heifer? There's a couple of things that's unusual about a red heifer. One, that it's red, and second, that it's a heifer. Both of those things are odd, but what makes both of those things odd? A female. What would we normally expect? It's always a male animal. It's always a male animal. You look at any of the other sacrifices, it's always males, except for the red heifer. And as far as I'm aware, there's never any other, there's no other sacrifice where the color of the animal is required, right? Just that there's no defect, no spot or blemish. But here, the Lord is very specific. It has to be a red heifer. And the way that this has been interpreted historically is a completely red heifer, as in like no white, no black. Some of the historical interpretations that I've read of this law say that a heifer is disqualified for having two, or even in some cases as few as one, like white or black hairs on them. The heifer has to be completely red. Now, whether that's realistic or not, I don't know. That's people commenting on the text. That's not from Scripture itself. But it is odd that the text specifies that it has to be red. So this is an interesting sacrifice here. Yeah, it makes the priest unclean. You have to do it outside of the city. Sorry? Verse 6, yeah, so the cedar wood, and the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. Those are, so that's the stuff that you see associated with the cleansing of a leper in Leviticus. And I suspect that that is tied in with like the cleansing purpose of these ashes. Because that's what this whole sacrifice is for. They're going to collect up all of the ashes and keep them. And these can go into storage for a long, long time. They don't offer the red heifer very often. I think from the historical records that we have during the Second Temple period, so in between the captivity and the time of Christ, we've got records of 8 red heifers being offered. Because you don't have to use a whole lot of ash in the water of purification. So, do you have a question? That's in, if I remember right, it's in one of the jars. I don't think it's the water that would be in the basin. But there are other jars kept for purification. And in fact, it's a practice that we know spreads outside of the temple and outside of the tabernacle by Jesus' time, because in John chapter 2, what do we got going on? Well, Jesus tells the servants to fill up the stone jars full of water, and what are the stone jars used for? For purification. So exactly where they kept that in the tabernacle, I'm not sure off the top of my head. But they would have had water for purification, just like they would have had water for the sota ordeal. You know, the priest is supposed to take water and mix some of the dust in it. That's a good question. We see some echoes, I think, between this and the sota ordeal. I mean, namely one, in just that they seem to come out of the blue. Like, this is just odd, right? There's all this other stuff that this is a really unique thing. And then you've got the water, the mixture of water with either dust or ash to be used for ritual purpose. So I think they are related in some way. But this one, the express purpose of this red heifer is that you're going to use the ashes to mix in water for impurity. Right? So it's for cleansing. It's for ceremonial cleansing. Let's see. Oh, there was another thing that made it weird. At the end of verse 2. The stipulation that it is an animal on which a yoke has never come. We don't see that stipulation made elsewhere for the sacrifices. At least we haven't up to this point. We didn't see anything like that in Leviticus. And I actually was just searching a second ago while I was reading. And this is the first time that we see anything about a sacrifice that can't have been yoked. Mm-hmm.
When they, knowing this ahead of time, when they kind of say, oh, there's a red heifer, let's set him aside.
Well, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do.
Aside, just,
Mm-hmm.
the yoke, and that kind of lends itself towards, the Pharisaical, can't do this, can't do that, this kind of thing.
Not necessarily. It's...
I'm just saying it lends itself towards
talking about like the standard, like the practice of Corban, that this thing is consecrated to the Lord. Like, perhaps, because you do see the Pharisees engaging in that and saying to their own needy family members, hey, I can't help you because all of this money I have squirreled away over here is dedicated to the Lord.
But what I'm saying is that this particular heifer, you kept away from everything. You couldn't bother it, you couldn't make it,
Yeah, you're not going to work with it.
You couldn't do anything because it was special.
Yeah,
So a special place.
that would definitely be the expectation for this heifer. So if you are the red heifer, life is really good for you until it's not.
Yeah.
So let's see. It seemed like there was something else here. No, I think that is pretty much all of the weird stuff. It's hard to keep track of all of it. All right.
Well, he blood and he sprinkled it with his finger
Mm-hmm.
in front of the tent of meeting.
Yeah. Now that we would consider that, I think, to be fairly normal. Like the sprinkling of blood is fairly standard practice for a sacrifice in the law of Moses. So we saw that even at Mount Sinai, whenever Moses takes some of the blood and sprinkles it on the congregation of Israel. We see it with the burnt offerings on the altar of burnt offering, that the blood is thrown against the side of the altar. So that's fairly standard. All right, but all of this is done for the cleanliness of Israel. And that's where the rest of the chapter is going to be about the cleanliness of Israel. All right, laws concerning clean and unclean. But before we jump into the rest of that, I want us to consider, let's consider another passage first before I flip the board over. Turn to Hebrews chapter 9. Because the Hebrew writer makes something of this sacrifice. Hebrews chapter 9, we'll start in verse 11. All right, and the Hebrew writer is tying together a whole bunch of stuff from the law and comparing it to the sacrifice of Christ and the priesthood of Christ, and just using all of this stuff to talk about the supremacy of Christ. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. So before we continue any further, just notice everything that the Hebrew writer has done just in a couple of short verses. Christ is the superior high priest and the superior tent, right, the superior tabernacle, and he has actually entered into the real holy place, and he has done so by a superior blood, his own blood, not through the blood of goats and calves. All right, so all of this, again, he's wrapping everything together. This is where Christ is superior. For if, all right, now here he's going to make an argument from the lesser to the greater. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer, so there's our sacrifice right there. If those things sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? All right, so as far as the Hebrew writer is concerned, this sacrifice, along with everything else in the law, but he singles out the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer. All right, that's this sacrifice, the red heifer. He says, if that is good for sanctifying, for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ purify our conscience? Right? So whenever we read this in Numbers 19, it is preparing us for and pointing us forward to the sacrifice of Christ and what it does in purifying us. And this is something that commentators have picked up on basically from the beginning. Right? Not just the Hebrew writer, but ones that came after him as well. That there are all of these similarities between this distinctive sacrifice of the red heifer and the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. One of them, the Hebrew writer himself brings up, that Christ offered himself without defect or without blemish before God. We read that in verse 14. Who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God. Some of the church fathers made something of this requirement that the red heifer have never been yoked before, so it hasn't done any manual labor. They noted that Christ himself was never yoked with the yoke of sin. This one I consider especially fruitful, that both were sacrificed outside of the camp. Right? And this is where the red heifer is distinctively a type of Christ, because like we've said, no other sacrifice was offered outside of the camp. It was only the red heifer until Christ, who gave himself outside of the city. He was not offered up, on the altar of burnt offering in the temple, but taken outside the camp. This is another thing I forgot to mention. It is distinctive. Well, we did kind of mention this. It's distinctive that the whole red heifer is offered up in this way. Like we said, normally you would separate out the skin and the dung and everything, and it would go outside the camp, but the animal would stay inside. But the red heifer, alone among sacrifices, early sacrificed animals, is sacrificed whole, just as Christ was offered in his entirety for us. Now this leads, by the way, to an interesting contrast between the red heifer and Christ, because even though they were both offered wholly, so entirely, Christ still has a memorial portion. So notice that's one of the distinctive things about the red heifer. So far we've only read of one other sacrifice, the burnt offering, that does not have a memorial portion. That is the portion that the priests take off and eat themselves. Right? In most other sacrifices, you have some of it that is put on the altar and burnt up, but then the priests take part of it for their own meal. The red heifer does not have a memorial portion. It's burnt up entirely, and it's used for purification. Christ happens to be, the red heifer is a type of Christ, but Christ is obviously superior to the red heifer because he can be offered wholly, he can be consumed entirely, and yet still have a memorial portion. Because the Lord's Supper is our memorial portion. I don't know if you'd ever thought of it that way, but if Christ is a sacrifice, well, what does that make the Lord's Supper? Well, if you're reading it through the lens of the law of Moses, the Lord's Supper is our memorial portion, right? It's like Peter has said, we're a nation of priests, right? We're a holy priesthood, like all of us are priests in Christ. And whenever we take the supper, we're taking the memorial portion. So that's a contrast between Christ and the red heifer. Another interesting thing is that, so you don't have Aaron offering the red heifer. And that is kind of distinctive because normally, all right, so we know that Eleazar and his brother were able to offer sacrifices. They were ordained to do that. But up to this point, everything has been addressed to Aaron because he is the high priest. So he's considered like he's the main guy. He's doing most of the work. But here it is specified that somebody who is not the high priest will make the offering. I think, and the text doesn't explain this, I suspect it's because of this uncleanness. Right? You can't put the high priest in a position where he's going to become unclean. But one of the other priests, one of the chief priests, you can put in that position. And we happen to see Christ given as an offering by the chief priests. In both cases, the heifer and Christ are given for purification. And then this one, I think, is another very fruitful connection. Just like how he sacrificed outside of the city, that's distinctive. This is another thing that is completely distinctive to the red heifer. That the red heifer causes uncleanness. Again, that's weird for a sacrifice. That it would make the priest offering it unclean. And yet, what do we read? I mean, in Peter's Pentecost sermon, right? That they've incurred guilt by offering Christ as a sacrifice, right? It's kind of like, well, it's a classic question: was killing Christ a good thing or not? You got to be careful how you answer that, right? Because, yeah, it's good. Exactly. I think that's the best answer for it. It's good so long as you're not the one doing it, right? Wayne?
Didn't Christ take on our sins on himself?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
He made himself.
Yeah, so the
So the heifer, they person sacrificing that clean, so Christ himself.
Yeah, so Christ takes our iniquity on himself. So in that case, the priesthood generally is a type of Christ, in that they're bearing the iniquity of the congregation, and Christ bears our iniquity on himself. But his sacrifice is given for cleansing, for purification. That's something the priests themselves can't do. Like the priest can bear iniquity, but there's no part of himself that he can give so that the congregation can be purified. That's why you have to have the ashes of the red heifer. Christ brings both of those things together in himself, in that he bears iniquity and can also offer purification from himself.
Another thing, the red heifer was burned whole and the ashes were put into the water for the purpose of purification. So you had to sprinkle water with the ashes on people in order to purify them. That to me is a type of baptism. In that the blood of Christ, the burnt heifer, goes into the water, and that's where you contact the burnt heifer of the ashes of the
Yeah, that's because that's where you come into contact with the death of Christ. Yeah, it is a type of baptism. So absolutely. So any other? This is the stuff that I noticed. Any other fruitful connections that y'all have noticed between the red heifer and Christ? Again, it's the kind of distinctive sacrifice that is supposed to make you pause and kind of scratch your head a little bit. So, good questions and comments regarding the red heifer. Let's see. We've got less than a minute left here. Okay, we'll save the rest of Numbers chapter 19 for Sunday. But the rest of it is connected to this. All right, so the Lord has given us the remedy for uncleanness right here at the beginning of Numbers 19. Now, for the rest of Numbers 19, he's going to show us what the occasions for uncleanness are. Like verse 11, whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean 7 days. Right? And you've got the law concerning whenever somebody dies in a tent, starting in verse 14. You've got the laws concerning, like in verse 20, if a man who is unclean does not cleanse himself, what's going to happen to him? And all of this flows from this law of the red heifer. So,
These people will get sprinkled with this water and go to purify them before they
Yes, and to keep them from being cut off from the congregation. Yeah. And so there, again, I think we see another connection between the red heifer sacrifice and baptism, in that, yeah, you're not part of the congregation until you have accepted that cleansing. Yeah. So thank you so much for your questions and comments and your kind attention this evening.